Tonight's first panelist is Lance Berelowitz, and he is an urban planner, award-winning writer, and commentator on urban and cultural affairs. He's the founding principal of Urban Forum Associates, Town Planning, Urban Design, and Communications. He consults on urban planning and communication projects across Canada and internationally. And he's also the author of Dream City, Vancouver and the Global Imagination, the acclaimed book on Vancouver's planning culture and emerging urban form, which won the City of Vancouver's Book Award and was shortlisted for the BC Book Prize.
Thank you for that, Ray and John. And I'm just going to echo a couple of things that John really said, which is I too am grateful, looking back over those films from the late 60s, that much of what Arthur Erickson was positing did not come to pass. However, I'm going to go one step further and suggest that, in fact, in my opinion, and I'm on record as having said this in the past, that with all due respect to Mr. Erickson, I think Robson Square is a failed project that got built. And I say that it's a failed project not because it isn't a great piece of architecture, although beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and some might find it a great piece of architecture and others might find it curious or problematic. But from a planning perspective, what I was really struck by was how much of these ideas that Arthur was talking about 45 years ago found their way into Robson Square, and the vestiges of that John referred to, for example, the lower level skate rink plaza, which has always struck me as sort of, what was that all about? I never understood, so thank you for that, John. And I can imagine how much worse Vancouver would be if we had more of those sunken plazas. It's always struck me, ever since I got here in the late 1980s, that the best thing that could happen to Robson Square would if they just filled those holes in and created a proper square at ground level and ringed them with buildings that have active edges. The other piece, of course, of Robson Square that's very problematic is the plaza to the north, which used to be the main public square and forecourt to what was then a public building, the provincial courthouses, which, with the development of the new courthouses and converting the old law courts into the art gallery, essentially the front door was closed, thus rendering that public space essentially orphaned or divorced from the rest of the city. And I think we see the consequences of that still to this day. And I think the issue of creating a great and vibrant and animated public space in our city is still with us today. We're still grappling with us as topically as last Wednesday evening's events in the city. We're still struggling with how do we deal with and manage public events in the public realm and create the vessel or the physical environment for that to happen in a meaningful and in a positive way. So I think Robson Square, I'll just say that Robson Square, in my opinion, is it may or may not be a great piece of architecture, and I'll leave others to decide that. But I do think it's a failed experiment in urban planning, and it's sort of a vestige of Erickson's plan that you saw described the way Ray put it, as sort of like this top-down planning by kind of a demigod that kind of presented this as a kind of a fait accompli that others would have to accept. So I'm too am pleased, like you, Ray, that we no longer live in that era, although sometimes, of course, we do think that our ideas are the best and we're frustrated with public process. And I understand that there are planners now out there who are saying too much process and we need more product. So maybe I'll hand over to the current director of planning and see how he's doing in that department. I'll take some issue with that, with the presumption that modernism was all bad. I'm not suggesting that's what you're saying here, Brett, but one of the things that I actually quite enjoyed about Vancouver when I first arrived here was its freshness and its sort of lack of historical encumbrances, detail perhaps. And so there was something quite refreshing about the kind of, I would say, almost naive modernism that you still see fragments of here and there. And that, I think, is part of Vancouver's sense of place. Fortunately, it's not the dominant ethos anymore, or I'm not sure it ever was. But I think Vancouver would be the lesser if it didn't have that sort of layer of modernism, albeit not the dominant layer, because it does actually represent a sort of a sense of optimism and can-do attitude that I think is associated with a city as young and as new and as unencumbered with a kind of an establishment approach as Vancouver is. And certainly for someone like me coming from having lived and worked in places like London and Paris, that was extremely refreshing. And to the extent that we're losing that, I think Vancouver is losing part of its cultural heritage. So I would argue that our modernist heritage is actually a very important part of Vancouver's heritage. I don't know if that's something that Judith Maxman was directly involved in providing exemplary leadership in many people's opinions with regards to creating some of that synergy and some of those systems and methodologies that we are now the happy beneficiaries of. For example, something as banal and as simple as those development permit or rezoning boards, those signs that you see all over the city, he started them. They didn't exist before that. And something as simple as giving information on a corner like that, so when you walk or drive by, you go, oh, that's what's coming to my neighborhood. Ooh, I don't know if I like that. It gives you an opportunity, there's a phone number, a contact, use the contact. You go and
now,
you talk
of course,
to
they're not
right?
nearly enough. We need to do much, much more. But you're right, that was the starting point for even that level of information.
And I think that is an important point to take Ray's point, which is that Vancouver has, I think, developed quite a sophisticated system or systems for managing growth and change, which is scary and sometimes dangerous. We're not perfect, and I would agree with Ray's analysis that we can do a lot better. But I think the more important and most important point that I would like to echo on that is that architecture can only do so much. And in many cases, architecture is the problem, not necessarily the solution. And so we do need to moderate the forces of pure architecture or pure design by the influence of the public interest. And that is a kind of a mediated process which involves lots of different players and actors on stage, all having their two bits worth and coming up with some solutions that actually meet the greater good rather than simply one particular developer or architect's vision.